He's talking about how totalitarian regimes have studied the usage of ecstatic religious rituals and drugs combined together for mass conditioning. Huxley and these other people talk about how raves, he doesn't call them raves, but he says synthetic music, giant festivals can be mass rituals. Merleau talks about opium and the history of that and various past examples. Then he says hypnotism. Hypnotism can also occur when the state, as the big drug dealer, becomes a kind of handler, daddy figure, god figure who doles out drugs as sacraments. In fact, he says the ancient, I didn't actually know this, he says, unless Aquino talked about in one of his books, the ancient Egyptians apparently knew about hypnosis. So he says they were pretty proficient at hypnosis. Not everybody is susceptible to hypnosis, right? So it's only a percentage of the population that is actually very susceptible to hypnosis. So it doesn't work on everybody. But if you are the state and you want to have power and control, it's very tempting to try to marshal and utilize hypnosis on the masses if possible. Then he talks about what, again, isn't exactly MK Ultra, but inadvertently backs up what everybody has criticized about MK Ultra and theorized about it in part, which is that many studies and approaches to hypnosis were part of MK Ultra as well. And the notion of programming people in a hypnotized state to do certain things. Trigger codes, alters. It is discussed here on pages 62 and 63. He doesn't say he knows for sure how effective it is, but it has been studied and it is possible, he says. Mass hypnosis, he says, is also possible. And the totalitarian state would like to have the masses in a place of mass hypnosis or mass form psychosis. Sounding familiar? You've probably heard this term in the last few years. Oh, actually, what you're hearing is not new. Right? Mass M, you know what? And that's one of those terms that flags the algorithm, so I'm not going to... Guess what? It was already in this book in 1956. In fact, if I recall, the way I heard about this book was during COOF. Somebody was talking about that terminology, and they said it was in this book. So I was like, oh, interesting. I didn't know. I've never heard of this book. I'm going to get it. The exact phraseology is not in the book, I don't think, but the idea is there. Mass formation of hypnosis is there. And engineering of consent is in this book. So Chomsky, right, the engineering consent, guess what? That was already in this book. Now, as I was reading through these chapters, particularly here, the chapter of other techniques that the power structure, the handler, the mind controller, the state can do, it reminded me of religions, quite obviously. Now, the focus of the book's not religion, but he does constantly touch on it because elements of religious control, and particularly cults, play into this. And of course, we know all of our atheist buddies and our agnostic friends. Oh, religions are a cult, man. You're all in a cult, dude. Yeah, I know. We've heard this a million times. We know that's what you think. But even if you think that, let's set that aside for a moment. Certainly some religions exemplify a totalitarian cult behavior more than others. We can think of examples like Scientology, Jonestown. We've all heard of those a million times. Brainwashing, mind control, Heaven's Gate, blah, blah, blah. But because I was reading this book, as I was also interacting and prepping and, dealing with Muslims, I was thinking, actually, a lot of this perfectly lines up with Islam, doesn't it? And I'm not just singling out Islam. You could say, oh, does it line up with Rabbinic Judaism? Yes, sure. But Islam is more on my mind because of the recent debates. And if you notice, one of the reasons that I asked Daniel in the debate about the washings that they do, voodoo, was because, well, in Christian theology, there's a reason for these bodily washings, right? And the Levitical laws. They're not just arbitrary because God said to do it. But I would argue that in the Talmud, in the rabbinic tradition, and in Islam, there's really no reason why there's all of this madness, I guess you could say, neurosis of I'm going to trick God by buying a certain, light switch that I'm not actually flipping the switch, and so it's not actually a work on the Sabbath. I'm going to buy a specific toilet flush that is not allowing me to flush the toilet on the Sabbath. I mean, just silly stuff, right? And then in Islam, we have these washings and these things we do. Why? Because Allah says to. And that was what he said in the debate. Now, in Christian theology, they symbolize moral things because there's nothing inherent. I mean, it's silly to think about something like pork being, pork's unclean. Why? Well, didn't God make the pig? Did you ever think about that? Remember in the debate with Azra Rashid? God can't come from vagina. God is not going to near vagina. Didn't God create the vagina? Did you think about that? And by the way, as Sam Shamoon showed, Allah breathes into vagina. So what are you even talking about? In the hadiths, right? I believe it was in one of the hadiths. But, so anyway, pointless rituals are part of control. So I'm not saying all rituals are mind control. That's what the typical sort of, euphoric atheist would say. It's all mind control, dude. Repetitive, meaningless rituals with no significance are a form of mind control that the totalitarian leader, be he a state controller or a cult leader, can use, you see. And by the way, cult leaders use drugs too, don't they? Of course they do. In fact, Merleau brings up Huxley's Brave New World as a classic example, because remember, he mentions Huxley, and then he talks about Doors of Perception. Why is he talking about that? Because you guys remember we did a lecture through Doors of Perception. Huxley says we need to get rid of the Lord's Supper and have a whole new religious sacrament in the West of mescaline. I don't know why he thought mescaline would be the sacrament. He says, get rid of bread and wine, Lord's Supper. No, we want mescaline as the sacrament of the West. Remember that? We did a whole lecture on Doors of Perception. All right, moving on. Next chapter. Why do people yield? What are the psychodynamics of false confessions? And what ultimately gets people to yield and give up their beliefs, their individuality, whatever, when they submit to the regime, the collective, the system, whatever? People will usually side with authority. This is one reason why appeal to authority, in its most basic sense, is a fallacy. Because depending upon what the debate is and who the authority is, authorities can be wrong. In the totalitarian regime, however, the control state, the super state, the corporate state, whatever it is, the authority cannot be wrong. There is no questioning of it. And if you want to ask questions about the system, those are questions that aren't even on the table. They're outside the magic circle of what Vogelin talked about, and they're not allowed to be asked, you see. So the system controls what questions can even be asked. That's a crucial element to these types of systems. That ultimately is a critique from Eric Vogelin. But unfortunately, because people tend to, on the whole, be somewhat weak, somewhat pliable, somewhat fearful, they tend to defer to and side with authority out of fear and out of a desire for security and projected glory. They want to feel like they're part of the winning team and I agree with the leader or whatever. So mass man, unfortunately, has his views given to him. How? Through the mass media. So they understood that even at this time. This, by the way, is absolutely identical to what Bernays says, right? We've lectured through Bernays' propaganda book. It's one of the classic writings of the elite, and that this jives perfectly with that.